Welcome to the Introverted Misfit podcast with me, Caroline Smith, where we discuss topics to help awkward and anxious introverts create fulfilling relationships and build community while being their authentic selves. Today's podcast explores the essential role of introverts in what I call the introvert-extrovert balance. And I want to start this podcast off a little differently than usual. I'm going to start it by reading a poem that I wrote a few months ago, and I titled it The Meek Deer and the Roaring Lion. Would not it be a funny tale if deer should envy lions? The deer would ask, "Say, how'd you get so prideful without trying? The fearless way you sway your hips without a thought of hiding. The way you hold your head up high sends all who see admiring. And oh, that mighty roar demands that all who hear it listen. They scatter and cease their prior doings in reverent adoration. Your eyes are full of great assurance that suggests no inhibition, and all I seem to have's unyielding fear that screams submission. So tell me, how can I attempt to do the things you do? To strut, to roar, command the floor, and gleam with pride like you. Relax, my child, the lion says. You'll learn in time that's due that every wonder has its place, and that includes you too. Birds were meant for flying high, seasons meant for changing. Roaring lions lead the pride, meek deer were meant for grazing. Grazing keeps the grasses trimmed that shapes our natural dwelling. 'Cause if the grasslands grow unchecked, there'll be no room for seedlings. And if the seedlings have no room, there's nothing we can sow, which leaves the land more vulnerable, and nothing new can grow. You see, we all have special roles that keep our world from ceasing, and just because yours is not mine does not defeat your meaning. So we must be content with who we are. There's no denying that it would be a tragic tale if deer should envy lions. I honestly forgot about this poem until I came up with the topic of this podcast episode, and then I suddenly remembered that this topic is the exact message that I was trying to portray in this poem when I wrote it months ago. And that message is that the scale of introversion and extroversion is one aspect of how human societies remain stable in our relationships with one another, or at least I think it is. So, a quick disclaimer: the complexity of the human mind and the human experience is so vast that I understand trying to simplify it down to introverts and extroverts is greatly oversimplifying it. But, this episode is just me telling you my thoughts based on my own experience and research as it pertains to introversion and extroversion. So, equilibrium. Equilibrium is a state in which opposing forces or influences are balanced. And if there's one thing I remember from my high school biology class, it's that every living being is constantly trying to keep itself in a state of stability, otherwise known as homeostasis, which is the tendency toward a relatively stable equilibrium within our body maintained by physiological processes. Everything from the smallest microbe to the largest living organism needs to be in a state of homeostasis to survive. That's why we feel hunger and thirst, because those are our body's ways of telling us that it needs energy and hydration to keep our organs working and to get back to equilibrium. That's why we sweat, especially in this sweltering heat that we've been experiencing this summer, because our body is trying to regulate its internal temperature. Another example of equilibrium. Even our brains, we even try to keep our brains at a stable point so that we are mentally stable, mentally and emotionally stable. We feel mental anguish when something in our environment or within ourselves is not right. And oftentimes, in an effort to get our brain chemistry back to a state of stability, we find all kinds of different ways to cope, some more healthy than others. But the point is, with these coping mechanisms, we're trying to reach mental equilibrium. And even on a much broader scope, if you think about how different organisms in an ecosystem are able to sustain life, there must be a settling point of equilibrium. Otherwise, the ecosystem cannot thrive. So, in the savanna grasslands, if there are too many primary consumers, which are organisms that eat plants, and there are not enough tertiary consumers, so the apex predators that hunt the lower level consumers, it throws everything off. And they'll eat up all of the plants, and then when there are no more plants, the producers or plants die off, and then the tertiary consumers have less prey to eat until the plants have a chance to flourish again, which will then create more resources to sustain the primary consumers so that the predators can have more game to hunt, and so on and so forth. All of this in the name of reaching a state of balance or equilibrium in the ecosystem. Even something as basic and foundational as a household needs equilibrium, or at least the people living inside of the house together need to have stable relationships in order for people to be content and for people to be able to deal with each other's conflict in healthy ways. And I could give so many more examples, but hopefully you get the general picture by now. So when you think about this concept of equilibrium and how it can be found in pretty much every area of life, that got me thinking about how that might manifest in human societies and communities where, societies are essentially just made up of individual people with varying personality types and other attributes. So that includes introverts and extroverts, men and women, feminine and masculine energy, people who know when to be quiet and people who don't know when it's time to stop talking so much, people with high emotional intelligence and people with poor control and understanding of emotions, rich people and poor people. Basically, all of these varying degrees of the human condition. And since the beginning of when the first humans, existed and formed their first societies, we have been trying to reach our own version of equilibrium while having to grapple with these undeniable facts of life, of humans. That's why every few years there seems to be a new war that breaks out over resources, arguments about who should and shouldn't be in political positions, and a whole host of other conflicts that we just can't seem to resolve. So, what does all of this have to do with introverts, extroverts, and even ambiverts? So, here's my main thesis. On the societal level, I think that introverted and extroverted personalities are opposing forces that balance communities out because of our differing strengths and weaknesses. And on the individual level, I think it's important that we don't become so pigeonholed into our own natural introverted or extroverted tendencies that other important aspects of society suffer and our lives suffer. Because, personality types exist on a spectrum. We're not all the way on this side of the spectrum, we're all the way on the other end of the spectrum. It's likely that we're somewhere in the middle of the spectrum, maybe on closer to a certain side, but we're somewhere on the spectrum, right? And so I'm going to break up my supporting arguments to this thesis into two main sections. And the first is explaining why this balance is necessary on the individual and societal level. And then the second one is how we as individuals involved in a society can find balance within ourselves to be better counterparts to others in our community. So why is balance necessary? I'm going to start this section off using an example that some of you may be familiar with and others may not. It's a religious example, but it's not going to be a divisive example if you are or are not a believer in some deity. because I'm purely focusing on the people here. It's not really about religion or spirituality at all. It's an example that's pertinent to my my own life. So I'm using that. So I've grown up in church pretty much all of my life, except for a few years in college when I was, as we all probably do, questioning my walk of faith in Christianity. And I eventually returned to the church, but that's a story for a different day. And after 20 years of listening to many sermons from the perspective of a congregational member or an audience member, for those of you who aren't familiar with church language, I've learned that congregations or audiences can often have their own overall personalities during a church service. And similarly, pastors will have their own personalities when they are delivering the sermon. And I would broadly classify these personalities that I'm referring to as introverted and extroverted styles of preaching and worshiping. So, on one hand, I've seen pastors who are more extroverted and expressive in their delivery, and they communicate with a lot of emotion, loud vocals. Sometimes they go as far as to jump around on the stage or in the pulpit while they're preaching the gospel, right? And kind of a funny story, a family member of mine who has been a church pianist in an organization, a church pianist and organist for over 30 years would jokingly call these types of pastors hooping and hollering pastors. And my family is from the South, so that's kind of how all of them talk, hooping and hollering pastors. And so when these types of pastors are preaching to an equally as extroverted audience, it seems like a great fit for them because the audience is responding back to them excitedly. And they're exclaiming things like amen, hallelujah, thank you, Lord, very joyously and loudly. And sometimes they'll even start to clap their hands and dance around, jump around too, just like the pastor will. And you can tell that they really feed off of each other's energy in this exchange. And on the other hand, you have the more introverted and reserved pastors who are not as overly expressive in their delivery. The sermons almost sound like a lecture in a school or a very tame conversation. It's a much calmer and quieter atmosphere that's more conducive to self-reflection and deep thought. And when these types of pastors are preaching to an equally as reserved congregation, you can tell that there is a kindred spirit and mutual understanding between the pastor and the congregation by the nodding heads in agreement, the smiles, the mild laughter, the quiet verbal responses, if there are any responses at all. Most of the time, it'll just be a silent congregation while the pastor is preaching. So as you can imagine, it's quite an interesting event to witness what happens when those scenarios are switched up. And I've been a witness to just about any combination you can think of. So when you have an extroverted pastor with an introverted audience, it's almost like watching someone yell at a brick wall. That's the best way that I can explain it, because it's clear that sometimes that the pastor is expecting more of a response, of a expressive and emotional response from the congregation that they're not getting. And I've even seen this cause some tension sometimes, like when the pastor will half jokingly suggest that the audience must just not understand the message well enough because they're not responding as emotionally as the pastor would like them to, which is kind of crazy in my opinion, but it does happen. I've seen it. And when you have an introverted pastor preaching to a more extroverted audience, you can sometimes tell when the energies are mismatched because the audience is trying to respond verbally and emotionally to an energy that just isn't there. And it's kind of off-putting to watch. It's kind of like watching a dove softly cooing at a flock of noisy birds, is how I would put it. And I've even heard some churchgoers after the sermon is over, suggests that, you know, the pastor wasn't expressive enough for them, which is to say that maybe they thought that his delivery was too boring or not interesting enough for their taste, right? And both of these scenarios that I was thinking about when planning out this episode got me thinking, wow, is the delivery really that important to some people that they will either intentionally ignore or just, not be able to grasp the message of the sermon because they couldn't get past the preaching style? And as it turns out, that's exactly what can happen. And the church is not the only example that you could use here. I could have done a similar example using a teacher or a professor who's teaching a class, exhibiting certain personality traits as a whole, or a team leader in a team pairing at your job or some other scenario. So, how do my observations in my decades of going to church prove anything about this equilibrium in society? Well, I think it shows that going too far in one direction about most things in life is generally not good. And if you think about it, a church is kind of its own little community or society within a larger society. And so in that way, I think this is a good example of the concept that I'm trying to demonstrate. And you can see examples of that in other areas, including in the current American political climate, where we've got these two opposing parties, Democratic and Republican, that don't seem to be going anywhere anytime soon. They've been here, they've been established for a long time, and it doesn't seem like people want to even discuss getting rid of the two-party system, right? And there seems to be no room for the in-between voters who can acknowledge that there are good and bad aspects of both political parties, and that we might not want to go full throttle on one side just because it's the side that you want to win in this competition, right? It really is a mess that we've made for ourselves, because it's like we can't find any equal grounding on some pretty important issues. But in terms of the introversion extroversion scale, I think it's possible for society to be so catered for more extroverted tendencies that there's no room for important individual activities like self-reflection and deep thought, which are important skills that are involved in changing yourself and evolving as a person. But on the other hand, if society was more catered to introverted tendencies, there may be no room for the more expressive and communal behaviors that can often pull us out of our own heads when we're so deep in our own thought that we can't, look up and see what else is out there. It's all a balancing act. Sometimes you need the introverted friend or boss or coworker or neighbor that's going to naturally encourage those important self-reflective and introspective behaviors. And sometimes you need the more extroverted counterpart that's going to keep you from going so deep within yourself that you'll end up driving yourself crazy. Because I've definitely been there too, as an introverted person who likes to stay in my own head a lot and think a lot about things rather than talking them out at first. And I think that once we understand those differences in each other on the individual level, that understanding will organically spread throughout society, because communities are nothing but individual people who are trying to get along with each other the best they can. So that's the first part of my argument, where I explain why I think the balance is necessary. And so in this next part, in the next part of this episode, I'm going to explain how I think we can find balance within ourselves to be better counterparts to our fellow introverts, extroverts, and ambiverts. So the first key to doing this, I think, is to have a mutual understanding of each other's personality differences. So by definition, an introvert is a quiet, reserved person who tends to be introspective and enjoys spending time alone. And an extrovert is an unreserved person who enjoys and actively seeks out social interaction. So, just by hearing those two definitions, you can kind of see where the opposition comes into play here. And as a lifelong introvert myself, who grew up with an extroverted, larger than life sister, I know how frustrating it can be when those opposing personalities clash. Because I never understood my sister's innate need to speak to any and everyone who would listen to her, no matter where we went. And she never understood my natural tendency towards being quiet and my aversion to starting conversations with people, even people that I know. And it turns out that there's a reason for this because scientifically introverts and extroverts have differently wired brains in the following ways. And um, I'm going to put a link to the statistics that I'm about to follow up with in the description of this episode. So the prefrontal cortex is thicker in an introvert's brain than an extrovert's. This means there's more tissue in the area of the brain associated with decision making and deep thought. As Dr. Lisa McLean, Henry Ford health psychiatrist, put it, since extroverts have thinner matter in the prefrontal cortex, they process information quickly and tend to react impulsively compared to introverts who mull things over before deciding on a course of action. While introverts and extroverts have the same amount of dopamine in their brains, extroverts have a more active dopamine reward network. For example, when extroverts prepare for a party, they feel motivated, energized, and excited, while introverts may feel less enthusiasm or a sense of dread under similar circumstances. Oh, and I don't know how to pronounce this word. Acetylcholine is linked to pleasure like dopamine. However, unlike dopamine, it makes a person feel good when they're calm, quiet, and introspective. And introverts tend to have more of these hormone receptors in their brains than extroverts. So in a calm environment, introverts are able to reflect and focus on the task at hand without a lot of external noise. So once we can learn to accept each other's differences for what they are, I think introverts and extroverts can be much better counterparts in a community. And just to revisit my church example for a second, I've witnessed quite a few of these seemingly mismatched pairings of pastors and audiences that actually work well, despite the personality differences. And I think what makes them work so well is that there is an understanding from the pastor that just because this crowd doesn't express themselves the way I do doesn't mean that they aren't taking in and understanding the message. And it's not my job to force the audience towards expressing themselves in a particular way. It's my job to deliver the message in a way that feels most natural to me, speaking from the pastor's perspective. And similarly, there's an understanding among the congregation that even though this pastor's delivery might not be their cup of tea, that doesn't mean that they can't get some value from the message if they just, put delivery to the side and pay attention to the words that the pastor is saying. It's about the mutual understanding that makes it work as well as it does, not just in this scenario, but a lot of different scenarios. The second key is to become confident in our own strengths while acknowledging our weaknesses. So just as we've all got our own strengths when it comes to communication, relationship building, information processing, and more, We can also acknowledge when a situation requires a skill set that we just don't have, and that's okay. So I mentioned earlier that I have an extroverted older sister, and it's amazing to me to watch how she can just walk into a room full of people that she does not know or that she barely knows, and immediately she can be engaging with 10 of them all at once within minutes, as if she was just supposed to fit in there all along. And so they'll be laughing, telling stories, hugging each other, having fun, just really connecting with each other in this group setting. And I used to be really self-conscious about the fact that I couldn't do that until that's just not in my personality. That's not how my brain is wired. Until I realized that my unique strength of connecting with people one on one allows me to create some very deep and genuine connections that I know for a fact wouldn't be possible if I was trying to engage with multiple people all at once, because that's simply not my strength. And that's okay. We can't all be good at everything, but we are all good at something that can contribute to the betterment of society. If you happen to be an introvert that needs help building some confidence in yourself as well as your social skills, you can receive my free 6-step guide to small talk for awkward introverts by clicking the link in the description of this episode. And the third and final key is to not let a label like introvert or extrovert define your every move. We all have our natural tendencies as introverts and extroverts, but sometimes the moment calls for you to take a step out of your comfort zone to make something great happen, whether that's in a meeting at work or in your friend group or to a stranger in the grocery store. And I'll give you an example of something that I witnessed happen about a year ago now in an airport of all places. So I was traveling with my 2-year-old niece to Atlanta, Georgia, or from Atlanta, Georgia, rather. And I was waiting for a TSA to search through the diaper bag for the bottles of formula that had set the alarm off. And there was a woman in front of me who was actually previously, while we were in line, she had been waving and smiling and talking to my niece, which I very much appreciated, because it's not every day that you run into somebody that nice in the largest airport in the Southeast, right? Where everybody's got their own places to go and they're all in a rush and there's all these people around and everybody is stressed out and everything. And I happened to notice that the GSA was examining 2 large white candles with pictures of 2 women on them. One woman was older and then the other one was much younger. And I could tell by the formatting of the text on these candles that the women had recently passed away on the same day, unfortunately. And these candles belonged to that same woman who was previously interacting with my niece before. And so, being the quiet and reserved person that I naturally am, I decided not to invade this woman's time and personal business with my questions, even though I really did feel very sorry for her after I finished putting the pieces together that she was probably traveling, the trip that she was traveling was probably related to these 2 women who had passed away in her life. So it happens that another woman who came up a few seconds later had a different idea than me. And, she walked up to this woman and kindly asked her what those beautiful candles were for. And immediately the woman breaks out in tears, only to tell her that the 2 women who had passed away were her best friend and the best friend's daughter, who was her goddaughter, who were in a tragic accident just a few days ago. And so she was traveling to the memorial service. And after a few minutes of the women talking and embracing each other and just, being very warm towards each other, the woman with the candles did not leave the interaction without telling this other woman how much she really appreciated her condolences and her kindness, even in the middle of such a hectic place like traveling at an airport. And now, mind you, these are two complete strangers who had never met each other before and probably would never see each other again. And it was such a wholesome moment to witness. But can you imagine if that other woman had not walked up at that time and it was only me standing there thinking, well, I don't want to pry, so I better not say anything, even though this woman had already exhibited to me that she was a very nice woman. I could tell that by how she was interacting with my niece, right? And, based on that interaction, I could probably um, infer that she wouldn't have minded some small talk and some meaningful human connection. And she probably would not have, turned away from if a conversation about the candles, right? So my point in telling that story is that I think it's good to know when it's time for you to speak up and engage with someone, even though it might not be a large part of your personality, as well as when it's time to take a step back from being the first one to speak and to listen to what others have to say. Again, it's all about this single concept of equilibrium, stability, and balance within ourselves, which will then go on to encourage equilibrium at a societal and communal level. At least that's what I think. So that's all for today's episode. If you enjoyed this talk, please don't forget to hit the follow button, leave a review, and share this podcast with your fellow introverted misfits. Thanks for listening, and have a great day.